Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first mini video demo for probably the simplest and most straightforward technique in watercolor. And I just want to take you through it step by step. Okay, so I'm going to tilt the camera down so that you can see what I'm doing here and my setup. I have here a very inexpensive watercolor pad. This is 140-pound paper, okay, which I recommend. If you go lighter than that, you're going to have a lot more trouble with buckling. So 140-pound paper, this is a spiral bound pad, very inexpensive, student grade. And I have a set of inexpensive student grade watercolors. This is a Van Gogh set with a range of different colors. And we're just going to start out monochromatically. And I'm just going to choose, this is a Payne's gray color, and we're going to work with that. So I had some questions about tube versus pan watercolors. I do prefer the tube colors because they're a little bit creamier coming out of the tube. So you can squeeze out a little right here. I still have some from my previous little demo. Okay, and I like this set because it does come with its own palette. You can use any kind of non-porous surface as a palette for watercolor. Here's another little palette with wells, very inexpensive. It's nice to have an open area for mixing here. You can pick those up pretty much in any art supply place. Or you can upcycle using plastic lids, for example. Okay, so this set also comes with a little sponge, which comes in handy. It's also nice to have some paper towels. These are just cheap paper towels we have here in the studio at the college. And I have a range of different brushes that we're going to experiment with. And this will be our first journal exercise. So for future reference, if you could just write at the top, this is our technique wet on dry, so that when you come back to this later, you'll know what technique you were practicing here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try a flat brush. And I have some different types of brushes here to work with. This one, actually, I have no idea what brand it is. The thing with watercolor brushes or brushes of any kind, they're not standardized. So a number 6 brush in one brand could be completely different size than a number 6 brush or whatever number brush in another size. Okay, but let's just start out with a flat brush. This is about a 1-inch size in width. And with watercolor, what we have to do is we do have to dip it in the water just to moisten the bristles. And through trial and error, we're going to figure out how much water for pigment that we need to work with, so that you'll just have to kind of play around with that and figure that out. Okay, so I'm going to swirl it around in the brush. Now, you would do the same thing with the pan watercolors, but maybe with a little more water just to swirl it around. You want to load it up on both sides of the brush and kind of work it in evenly. And what I want you to do is just to make a few strokes and just kind of see what happens when you make the stroke. So just kind of lay it down, okay? And one thing I do want for us to practice is, I think one of the best approaches to watercolor is just to let it kind of do its thing and not to mess with it. So notice I'm just going to lay down the stroke, and I'm not going to come back and mess with it at all, okay? So notice as I continue my strokes, if I don't reload the brush, you'll have less and less pigment in the bristles, and it's starting to get a little bit of dry brush effect, which we'll talk more about when we discuss additional techniques. So I was using, notice with the flat brush, you can actually use this narrower side of the brush and just experiment with making different strokes. And notice with a little more pressure, you'll get a little broader. Okay. I'm going to add a little bit more water to my brush. And let's just manipulate the brush in a little bit different way. We can start out using this narrow end and then just kind of twist it and see we can get what we would call a calligraphic stroke, where the brush, the mark goes from thick to thin. So you can play around with that a little bit. Just try some different effects. And just try loading up your brush with more and less water just to see what happens. Notice with more water, see how it puddles up in certain areas. Just go ahead and let it kind of do its thing and see how that looks after it dries. Okay, so that's the flat brush. Let's try also a round brush, and this is just an inexpensive little brush that came with this set. And again, we're just gonna load it up, just kind of swirl it around in the puddle here, and just make your stroke. And one thing, notice that I'm actually standing, which I like to stand when I'm painting so that I can have the full mobility of my arm. If I'm just kind of locking myself in like this, which you can certainly do maybe if you're doing more detail-oriented work, but it's a little bit more rigid, and it's really nice for the most part if you can keep your arm pretty loose and pretty mobile. And just kind of experiment with some different strokes. I'm getting a little more of a dry brush effect here, but just kind of see what the brush can do if you hold it in different ways, using different pressures, loading it up with more or less pigment, okay? Just kind of experimenting with the pigment to water ratio, okay? So just fill up the page experimenting. The other thing I'd like for you to do while we're practicing our wet on dry is scale, and notice how I've made a number of little blocks down here at the bottom. I made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I'm going to make one more block. I just have a little putty knife here, but you can use a straight edge. I just want to make one more block. So we have 7 blocks for our value scale. And notice how I'm leaving a little bit of space in between each block. Okay, now that's block number 7. Okay, now we might want to use a flat brush. This is actually a little Princeton brush. I like that brand because it's fairly inexpensive for the quality of brush that it is. I think they're very good quality brushes. So this is a little bit smaller flat brush. It's a 1/2 inch versus this size, which is 1 inch. Okay, what I like about this brush, notice how this has a little point at the end that you can use for another technique we'll talk about in a later video. But here's our little 1/2 inch Princeton brush. We're gonna swirl it up, and we have our 7 blocks, and we're gonna go just from dark to light. So I'm gonna load it up pretty heavily. I'm loading, loading, loading with quite a bit of pigment because I want this first block to be the darkest, okay? So I'm going to just lay this down, and again, try not to mess with it too much. And I'm gonna fill in this first block. This is my dark block, my darkest one. And I'm gonna just go sideways like this to make a nice clean edge coming down. But I don't wanna mess with it too much, okay? So what I'm gonna do as I move to lighter and lighter on my value scales, I'm gonna add a little bit more water to my brush, and I'm just gonna fill in the next block. So it's a little bit lighter because I have a little more water versus the pigment than I did in my last block. and try not to mess with it too much. One thing you'll notice as the paint dries, it's going to be significantly lighter. Okay, so that's one quality we should keep in mind here, is that watercolor dries lighter, which is pretty intuitive. I mean, that's what you would expect. But for those of you, if you've worked with acrylic, you'll know that acrylic paints actually dries darker, which is kind of counterintuitive. But I'm just adding a little more water and a little more water to my brush as I move this way on my value scale. Okay? So we want to get kind of a gradual transition to lighter and lighter and lighter, just so that we can learn that pigment to water ratio and the degrees of light and dark that we can achieve. I think typically with beginning watercolor students, what happens is we tend to maybe work the watercolor a little bit lighter, and it tends to look a little weak. So I just want to get into the habit of working with that full range of the watercolor washes, so that you can get that full degree of dimensionality into your work. Okay, so that's our first little exercise, wet on dry. And I will see you in our next video when we tackle some of the other techniques. Okay, give it a try.